In this lesson, we present a catalog of comparative statics. Comparative statics are thought experiments where you change something and see what happens. We call them statics because it refers to comparing one state with another state, the state before the change with the state after the change. In our last lesson, we did an example of comparative statics. We looked at what happens to a competitive equilibrium when we changed the price of a substitute good. We saw that the demand curve shifted and the price and quantity traded at competitive equilibrium changed. Well, that was only one example. Now we're going to present all the examples that I can think of. The thing to remember is there are a limited number of comparative statics that you can do in a supply and demand diagram. That's because there are only two curves you can shift and only two directions to shift each curve. So a complete catalog of comparative statics would look like the following. We would have one case where the demand curve shifts outwards, one case where the demand curve shifts inwards, one case where the supply curve shifts outwards, and one case where the supply curve shifts inwards. Each of those cases is going to lead to a different combination in changes of price and quantity. And each of those cases will correspond to a different set of stories about the real world. So what I'll do in this lesson is go through each of those cases one at a time until I've done all four. Let's start with case number one, the case we considered in the last lesson. Here's the case where the demand curve shifts outwards. If the demand curve shifts outwards, then if you hold the price steady at the original level, you will have an excess demand. The new quantity demanded will be larger than the old quantity demanded. The quantity supplied will be the same as before at that original price, and you've got excess demand or shortage. The bidding mechanism will push up the price of the good. Some buyers will drop out, and some new sellers will enter the market. The end result when the demand curve shifts outwards is the equilibrium price rises, and the equilibrium quantity traded increases. Now, what are the stories that could cause that to happen? The first story would be an increase in the price of a substitute good. When the price of a substitute good increases, the demand for bread itself will increase as consumers consume bread instead of bagels. The second case that would shift outwards the demand curve would be a decrease in the price of a complementary good. If the price of cheese falls, people want more bread and cheese sandwiches, so the demand for bread increases, pushing up the price and increasing the quantity traded in equilibrium. The third case would be if there were a change in consumer income, and here we have two possibilities. If bread is a normal good, then an increase in income will lead to an increase in demand for bread, and the higher price and larger quantity in equilibrium. If bread is an inferior good, on the other hand, then a decrease in consumer income would cause the demand curve to shift outward. If this were beans instead of bread, and beans were an inferior good, then lower consumer income would lead people to buy more beans at every price. And that would lead to a new higher price in equilibrium and a larger quantity of beans traded. Another thing that would shift outward the demand curve would be expectations changing. If people expect the price of bread to be higher in the future, they're going to buy more bread today. And quite ironically, that would push up the price of bread. It becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. If people are hoarding bread today for fear of higher prices in the future, their actions have the result of fulfilling the prophecy. The price of bread indeed rises. Finally, since this is the market demand curve for bread, an increase in the number of buyers in the market will shift the demand curve outwards. If the number of consumers grows in this market, or more people decide they like bread and enter the market for bread, that will push up the price and increase the quantity traded. So that's case one, an outward shift in the demand curve. And we looked at what happens and the stories that could lead to it. Let's consider now case number two. Case number two is the case of an inward shift in the demand curve. If the demand curve shifts inwards, then at the original price, we have now an excess supply of bread. With the demand curve shifting inward, consumers want less bread at every price. So at the old price, the quantity of bread demanded is less than the quantity of bread supplied, the point on the blue curve. This causes the bidding mechanism to kick in, sellers put their bread on sale, and the price of bread falls. As the price of bread falls, some buyers come back into the market for bread, and some sellers drop out of the market. The bidding mechanism comes to rest when the quantity demanded is equal to the quantity supplied at the new equilibrium price. The new equilibrium price will be lower. It had to fall to get rid of that excess supply. And the quantity of bread traded will shrink. Since people want less bread now, the quantity of bread actually traded in the market will be smaller. Let's look at the stories that could result in an inward shift in the demand curve. The first thing would be if the price of substitute goods falls. If bagels become less expensive, then people will buy less bread and more bagels instead. If the price of a complementary good increases, like cheese, if cheese gets more expensive, people want fewer cheese sandwiches, and that means they will buy less bread at every price. The demand curve shifts inwards because of the higher price for a complement. The third case would be a change in income, and once again we have two cases. If bread is an inferior good, then the demand curve shifts inwards when income increases. Consumers want less bread because now they're better off and they buy other things instead. But if bread is a normal good, then the inward shift corresponds to a decrease in income. When your income falls, you buy less bread at every price. Another thing that would shift inward the demand curve would be the expectation that the price of bread will fall. People delay their purchases of bread and the demand for bread shifts inwards. It's reduced. However, you can see that the expectation that future prices will be lower turns out to be a self-fulfilling prophecy. By reducing their demand for bread, people lead to a lowering of the price. The bidding mechanism kicks in, lowers the price of bread, and the expectation becomes self-fulfilling. Finally, the last thing would be if there are fewer traders in this market. With fewer traders in the market, the demand will be less, and therefore the equilibrium price will fall. All of these are the same factors that shift the demand curve outwards, only now we're considering the opposite cases. So there's case 2, an inward shift in the demand curve. This will occur anytime something causes consumers to want to buy less bread at every price. And the result is a lower equilibrium price and a smaller quantity traded in equilibrium. Let's look now at case number 3, an inward shift in the supply curve. Now we have a different set of factors that leads to an inward shift in the supply curve because we're no longer talking about the behavior of consumers. Now we're talking about the behavior of sellers. In this case, when the supply curve shifts inwards, the immediate result is that we have an excess demand for the product. That is, at the original price, the original equilibrium, where the original demand curve and the original supply curve cross, we have P star as our equilibrium price and Q star as our equilibrium quantity. If we keep the price constant and the supply curve shifts inwards, that is, if we have a decrease in supply, we're now going to have a small quantity supplied and a larger quantity demanded. So we have an excess demand for the product, given the new quantity supplied and the original quantity demanded. Well, this is going to cause the bidding mechanism to kick in, and as usual, the bidding mechanism deals with an excess demand by causing the price to rise. The price is bid up. And as the price is bid up, some buyers leave the market. And some of those sellers who thought they were going to leave the market come back in because the rising price makes it worth their while to continue to offer bread for sale. The result is that the price of the good rises in equilibrium. The new equilibrium price is higher, and the equilibrium quantity traded is smaller. This will be the case anytime the supply curve shifts inwards, anytime there is a decrease in supply. Well, what are the factors that lead to a decrease in supply? The first would be an increase in the price of inputs. If milk, eggs, or flour become more expensive, then our baker finds it less profitable to make bread, and bakers will bake less bread and sell less bread at every price. A second factor would be a change in technology. If technology worsens or our baker loses access to a low-cost technology, then the cost of production will increase. It's less profitable to make bread, and the quantity of bread offered for sale will be lower at every price. finally, there could be a decrease in the number of sellers in this market for any number of reasons. Remember, this is the market supply curve, and the market supply curve is the sum of the supply curves of the individual sellers. If we have fewer sellers in the market, the curve will shift inwards because fewer curves are being added together. Any of these factors will lead to an inward shift in the supply curve, and with that inward shift comes a higher equilibrium price and a smaller quantity traded. That's case number 3. Let's go now to the final case, and that is an outward shift in the supply curve. The outward shift in the supply curve occurs if sellers are offering more bread for sale at every price than they were before. Originally, the equilibrium price was P star, and the equilibrium quantity was Q star. However, something occurs that causes sellers to want to sell more bread at every price. At the original price, therefore, we now have excess supply of bread. The quantity supplied is greater than the quantity demanded at the original price. The bidding mechanism, once again, takes over and leads sellers to cut the price of their bread. To make sure they can sell their product, they lower the price. And as the price falls, some sellers decide that they're going to drop out of the market. They can no longer cover their opportunity costs. Meanwhile, the falling price draws some buyers into the market. These buyers are now willing and able to purchase more bread than they were buying before. The result is a new equilibrium price that's lower than the original. The equilibrium price falls in this market, and the equilibrium quantity traded increases. What are the real-world events that could lead to this outcome? The first would be if the price of input goods falls, making the production of bread more profitable. Sellers would make and sell more bread at every price than before. The second possibility would be an improvement in technology. With an improvement in technology, once again, production costs will fall, making it more attractive to offer bread for sale. Producers respond by offering more bread for sale at every price, an outward shift in the supply curve. And finally, if the number of sellers in this market increases, since it is the market supply curve, the supply curve shifts outwards. All of these factors shift the supply curve outwards, leading to a lower equilibrium price and a larger equilibrium quantity traded. So we have 4 cases, and each of these cases results in a different combination of changes of price and quantity. If the demand curve shifts outwards, the price increases, as does the quantity traded. If the demand curve shifts inwards, we have a decrease in the price as well as a decrease in the quantity traded. If the supply curve shifts outwards, the price will fall, but the quantity traded will increase. And if the supply curve shifts inwards, then the price will increase and the quantity traded will fall. Those are all the possibilities we have for comparative statics. So now that you've got the catalog, you're ready to try some experiments of your own.